The street was quiet that night, one of those evenings where even the wind seemed hesitant to move. It was October 12th, 2002. The air had that familiar, almost metallic chill of early autumn, the kind that makes your breath puff into clouds and your fingers tuck instinctively deeper into your sleeves. Lena Walsh had been smiling. The photographs taken only hours earlier inside the warmth of her family's dining room show her in midlaw, hair loose around her shoulders, eyes glancing toward her little brother as he blew out 10 candles on a cake that leaned just slightly to one side. It was a small birthday party, nothing extraordinary, just neighbors, cousins, a few of his school friends, but the kind of night you think you'll remember in the hazy golden way people remember childhood. She had hugged him twice before leaving. Her hand lingered over his gift, a bright yellow envelope with his name written in a handwriting he already recognized as hers. Inside it a card, but in that moment neither of them thought it was anything more than a sister's sweet birthday gesture. The party had ended earlier than usual. Some guests had left as soon as the cake was cut, retreating to their homes before the dark could fully settle. By the time Lena slipped on her jacket and stepped onto the porch, the neighborhood had fallen into that peculiar stillness where every sound feels amplified. The crunch of her shoes on the gravel driveway seemed too loud. The street lamps stood like frozen sentinels, their light spilling in pale, tired circles on the sidewalk. Her walk home was only 3 blocks. 3 blocks she had taken hundreds of times: morning walks to school, afternoon runs to the corner store, sleepy returns from friends' houses. It was muscle memory, safe, predictable, ordinary, except that night it wasn't. Neighbors would later say they remembered seeing her shadow pass beneath the first street lamp on Maple Avenue. A car engine had rumbled somewhere in the distance, but no one could place where. Someone's curtains had twitched, then closed again. A dog barked twice, then fell silent. She walked with her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, not in fear, just against the cold. The yellow envelope wasn't in her bag. She carried it in her hand. Perhaps she liked feeling the paper between her fingers, or maybe she just didn't want it crumpled. The card was for her brother, but for reasons no one could explain, she had taken it with her instead of leaving it behind. Later the police would call this a detail worth noting. At the time, it was just one of those things that didn't seem important until it did. 2 blocks from the house, the road curved slightly left, where a cluster of oak trees leaned toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. The branches shivered in the wind, scattering dry leaves across the path. Here, the light, thin street lamps were spaced wider apart, and the shadows between them felt longer, deeper. A witness, a man walking his dog, claimed he saw her there. He remembered the way she glanced over her shoulder once, as if checking for something or someone, but she didn't run, didn't seem panicked, just aware. His words in the report read, "She looked like she knew she was being watched, but didn't want to show it." The next street lamp flickered once, twice, and then Lena was gone. Not gone in the way of a scream or a sudden sprint into the trees, at least not that anyone heard, just gone in the way of a shadow swallowed by deeper shadow. From that point forward, there were no confirmed sightings. No one saw her turn the final corner. No one saw her step onto her porch. No door opened for her. No bedroom light clicked on the space between that flickering lamp and the safety of her front gate. Was less than 200 feet. 200 feet, a span a person could walk in 40 seconds, was all it took for the night to erase her. Her absence wasn't discovered immediately. At first, everyone assumed she'd made it home. Parents thought she was upstairs. Friends thought she'd gone straight to bed. By the time the truth crystallized, by the time someone realized she wasn't anywhere she should bite, was too late for the trail to be warm. That birthday night became a fixed point in the town's memory, a moment when a celebration became an ending, a moment when 3 blocks became an impossible distance. The yellow envelope would reappear later in her brother's room, untouched and unopened, but for now it existed as just another piece of paper carried by a girl who never finished her walk home. And though no one knew it, yet whatever Lena had written inside that card would become the only voice she left behind. The town of Willow Creek sits quietly on the edge of nowhere. It's the kind of place where the highway bypasses it without apology, where the welcome sign chipped, and Sunfedet still boasts a population number that hasn't been accurate in years. On paper, it was ordinary, neat rows of houses, with weather-beaten porches, lawns mowed in uneven strips, and mailboxes painted in the dull colors of practicality. The gas station doubled as a gossip hub. The single diner on Main Street had a chalkboard menu that never truly changed, no matter how often the specials were updated. But beneath that quiet rhythm was something harder to define, something that even before Lena disappeared had given the town a sense of holding its breath. People here remembered things, not just the major events, the floods, the snowstorms, the county fairs, but the small, unremarkable details of each other's lives. Who got married on a rainy Tuesday in '88? Which neighbor's dog had bitten the postman in the spring of '97? The smell of wood smoke from the McCarthy place in early October, always the first to light the fireplace. It wasn't just remembering, it was holding on, which is why even decades later people could still tell you exactly where they were the night Lena vanished. Some remember the weather, the sharp cold of that particular evening, how the wind rattled the loose gutter on the pharmacy roof. Others remember the sound of children's laughter carrying faintly across yards before the darkness settled in. A few recall a strange restlessness, a feeling they couldn't name, a tension in the air like the moment before a light bulb burns out. And then there are those who remember exactly what they saw, or what they think they saw: a girl walking under the maple trees, yellow envelope in hand, a car idling longer than it should have at the corner, a shadow that didn't seem to belong to anything. When Lena disappeared, the town reacted the way small towns do, with speed and suspicion. Neighbors who'd shared cups of sugar began to watch each other differently overnight. Fences felt higher, and front doors clicked locked earlier. Yet in the first days after she vanished, there was still hope that she had simply gotten lost or gone to stay with a friend or anything. But the other possibilities, that hope knitted people together in a way nothing else could. There were community search grids, flyers taped to every lamppost, church vigils where candles burned until wax pooled into the grass. But as days turned into weeks, hope began to turn brittle. The smiles of reassurance became tighter. Conversations dropped into silence. When certain names were mentioned, the phrase "last saw her" carried a weight that no one wanted to own. It was during this time that Lena's story became not just a tragedy, but a part of Willow Creek's identity. The missing girl became a fixture in the town's collective consciousness, not a memory to move past, but a scar to trace with restless fingers. For the younger kids of the time, she became a ghost story. Parents would tell them to stay close at night, not wander past the oak trees after dark. Her name, whispered on the school playground, carried the same mix of thrill and unease as an urban legend. But for the adults, there was nothing thrilling about it. For them, Lena wasn't a mystery to tell, she was a question they could never answer. Her face remained on the bulletin board inside the diner, tacked between advertisements for piano lessons and a flyer for a long-past bake sale. The picture was the same one from her brother's birthday, her half-smile frozen in the grainy light of a disposable camera, forever on the cusp of laughter. And over time, the way people spoke about her changed. In the first year, it was "when Lena comes home." By the second year, it was "if Lena comes home." And then eventually, "just remember Lena." Yet even as time dulled some of the sharper edges, there was one thing the town never forgot: the yellow envelope. That small, unassuming birthday card became the focal point of every conversation, every theory, every late-night speculation over coffee, because the card, ordinary in every way, would prove to be the one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit, the one object that seemed to hum with a meaning no one could quite touch. But in October 2002, no one yet knew what the card contained. They only knew that a girl had walked 3 blocks from a party to her house and had vanished somewhere in between, and in a town where nothing stayed secret for long. That was the most unsettling part. Whatever happened to Lena had managed to slip entirely, impossibly, between the cracks. There are photographs of that night, but the boy in them says he doesn't like looking at them anymore, not because they're blurry or because his hair was sticking up in the back, though it was, but because every frame is a before. A before he didn't know was a before he was 10 that night, old enough to remember details with clarity, young enough to believe the world was still mostly kind, and it had been his birthday. He remembers the cake first his mother had baked it herself, chocolate with blue frosting that stained everyone's tongues. The candles leaned at different angles because Lena had insisted on putting them in herself. She told him it made the cake look more alive. She always had a way of making things sound better than they were. The house had been warm, not just from the heating, but from the noise, laughter from the living room, the clink of glasses in the kitchen, the scrape of forks against paper plates had been darting between rooms, riding the attention high that comes only once a year. But he kept coming back to Lena. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, never had been, but she had a way of making her presence feel like the quiet center. Everything else swirled around. Shed tousle his hair every time he passed, smirking when he groaned in mock annoyance. At one point, she handed him an envelope, bright yellow, his name in looping cursive, "Don't open it." Yet she said he didn't ask why. He thought she was just being playful. She sometimes wrote silly riddles or drew cartoons in her cards, and his Mind, it was another one of those moments he'd laugh about later when she left. It wasn't dramatic, no drawn-out goodbye, no final look over her shoulder, just a quick squeeze of his arm, a happy birthday, kid. And she was gone. He remembers watching her through the front window as she zipped her jacket and started down the driveway, the envelope in her hand. He thought she'd put it in her bag by mistake. He almost opened the door to shout to her, but the moment passed, and she was already halfway down the street. The party carried on for another hour. More cake, more laughter. At 10 time, moves strangely. You don't measure it in minutes, you measure it in how full the room feels. And the room was full enough that he didn't notice how quickly the hours began to lean towards silence. It wasn't until later, when guests had trickled out and the dishes were stacked in uneven towers in the sink, that anyone realized Lena hadn't come home. His parents thought she'd stayed with a friend. Someone suggested she might have stopped by the store. The boy didn't think much of it. Lena was independent. She came and went as she pleased, but the first phone call to her friends brought no answers. The second call to the police changed everything that night. He remembers sitting on the couch, small legs tucked under him, watching his parents speak in low, urgent voices. Every few minutes, someone would glance at him like they weren't sure if they should send him upstairs or keep him where they could see him. He didn't understand the word missing the way adults did. To him, missing meant lost, and lost meant found. Eventually, the days after blurred together. People came in and out of the house. Neighbors brought food. No one ate. The boy stayed mostly in his room, where the yellow envelope sat on his desk like an accusation. He didn't open it. He couldn't explain why. Maybe he was saving it for when she came back. Maybe he thought it would make her return feel more like the ending of a story, complete with a gift she'd meant him to have. Weeks passed before he finally lifted the flap. It was a Thursday afternoon. The search teams had long since stopped combing the fields, and his parents had stopped jumping every time the phone rang. He told himself he just wanted to see what silly drawing she'd made this time. At first glance, it was exactly Theta, birthday card with balloons on the front, the inside filled with her familiar handwriting. Happy 10th, little man, you're my favorite. Pain in the neck, don't grow up too fast. But at the very bottom below her signature in smaller, sharper letters was a line he'd never seen from her before. Don't trust who picks me up tonight. He read it twice, 3 times, not understanding. Picked her up from where? And who was who? He took it to his mother. She went pale, the color draining from her face in a way that scared him more than the words. Had the police came back that evening, they asked him, when she'd given him the card, had she said anything else? Did he know what she meant? He shook his head over and over, feeling the beginnings of a guilt he couldn't name. As an adult, he would talk about the card differently, less about the mystery of the words and more about the fact that it had been in his possession the whole time. That maybe if he'd opened it sooner, something could have been done. That maybe she'd trusted him with the warning because she thought he'd see it, because she believed he'd act. It's a thought that has followed him through every birthday since. In the photographs from that night, he is still smiling, still unaware, but when he looks at them now, he doesn't see the cake or the candles or the guests behind him. He sees her and the envelope in her hand and the 3 blocks between his front porch and her disappearance stretched out into the longest distance he has ever known. The first night was chaos wrapped in denial. The police arrived quickly, their radios crackling in clipped bursts. But in those early hours, they still carried the polite tone of people expecting to find a misplaced teenager, maybe at a friend's house, maybe sulking in a park. No one wanted to admit the alternative. Neighbors stood in the driveways, drawn by the flash of red and blue lights against the dark. Some wore coats hastily thrown over pajamas. Others had coffee cups cradled in their hands like talismans against the cold. They whispered to one another, eyes darting toward the end of the street where Lena had last been seen, and then back to the Walsh family's front door. By midnight, the street had transformed into something unrecognizable. Patrol cars lined the curbs, their engines humming in the still air. A search perimeter was marked out 3 blocks in each direction from where she was last spotted. Volunteers joined the officers sweeping the sidewalks, calling her name into the night. Lena. Lena. The sound of it bounced back from the empty streets, making some flinch, as if it were an answer. The oak trees along the curve of Maple Avenue loomed like silent witnesses, their branches moved gently, spilling more leaves into the searchers' paths. Flashlights scanned the undergrowth, catching the gleam of discarded soda cans and glass bottles. Each glint made someone's pulse quicken until it became just another piece of trash. The K-9 units came at dawn, their handlers brisk and efficient. The dogs padded over the ground, noses pressed low, tracing scents that inevitably led nowhere. One paused near the base of the flickering street lamp, whining softly, but whatever trail it found dissolved within yards. The second day, brought the helicopters. Their blades thumped overhead, rattling windows, while spotlights cut across fields and backyards. People came out to watch, shading their eyes against the pale autumn sun. But from above, the town looked too ordinary too. Still, if Lena was anywhere within those grids, she wasn't showing herself. The Walsh family was asked to stay inside for much of it. Detectives needed their statements, needed photographs of Lena, needed the clothes she'd worn that night for scent tracking. The birthday decorations were still up in the kitchen, balloons, sagging, paper plates stacked in the trash. No one had the heart to take them down. Her little brother stayed mostly in his room, clutching the unopened card. In those first days, not knowing it was already the most important thing in the case. By the third day, the search widened. The wooded areas beyond the residential streets were combed by lines of volunteers in orange vests, walking shoulder to shoulder, eyes scanning for anything out of place. The air smelled of damp soil and gasoline from the ATVs buzzing along the trails. They found lost gloves, plastic bags snagged in branches, a shoe that turned out to belong to someone else entirely. Every time a call came over the radio, hearts spiked until the voice came back flat. Negative. Not her. Interviews began in earnest. Neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen her in those final minutes. People were polite, cooperative even, but under the surface there was an uneasy sense that by speaking too much they might implicate themselves. The police leaned into it, asking the same questions in different ways, noting hesitations. The man walking his dog was brought in again. He repeated his story about seeing her under the trees, about the glance over her shoulder, but when pressed, he admitted he hadn't actually seen her disappear. One moment she was there, the next his dog had tugged him forward, and when he looked again the sidewalk was empty. Another neighbor mentioned hearing a car door close, but couldn't remember the color of the vehicle or even which direction it had gone. Memory was already warping under the weight of the event. By the end of the week, the search parties dwindled. Volunteers had to go back to work, to school. The local news trucks packed up, leaving behind only the grainy footage they'd captured, clips of volunteers trudging through fields, close-ups of the birthday photo on a missing poster. The case shifted. It was no longer a rescue operation, it was an investigation. The tone in the police station changed. Officers who had once spoken to the Walshes with reassurance now carried notebooks and clipped voices. They asked about Lena's friends, her habits, her recent behavior. They asked if she'd been acting differently, if she'd argued with anyone, if there was anyone she didn't trust. Every question felt like it had a hidden edge. The family's answers were always the same. She was careful, independent, not the kind of girl to wander off without telling someone. But beneath those words was a growing sense of helplessness. They couldn't give the police what they needed most: some direction, some lead that would break the case open. In the quiet hours after the searchers had gone home, the streets returned to their ordinary stillness. Porch lights clicked off one by one, and somewhere in that silence the reality began to sink in, not just for the Walsh family, but for the entire town. If Lena could vanish from 3 blocks of familiar pavement, anyone could. On the 8th day, a detective told the family what they already feared. She didn't just walk away, somebody took her. It wasn't said cruelly, it was said like a fact carved into stone, the kind of fact that narrows the world into before and after. The birthday candles had burned down to nothing, the cake was gone. The yellow envelope still sat in the boys' room, waiting to be opened, its secret waiting to move the investigation in a direction no one was ready for. It was late afternoon when the boy finally tore open the yellow envelope. The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no cinematic swell of music, no thunderclap, just a quiet, almost bored motion, like scratching an itch you'd been ignoring. It had been 3 weeks since Lena vanished. The birthday decorations were long gone. The house had settled into that strange rhythm of grief, too quiet, too tidy, as if leaving things untouched might somehow preserve what was missing. Had kept the card on his desk this whole time unopened. Part of him had liked knowing there was still something of hers he hadn't touched yet, that there was a piece of her voice sealed inside, waiting. Maybe had been afraid that once he opened it, it would be final, that there'd be nothing left to discover. He slid his finger under the flap. The paper, giving way with a soft tear inside, was a generic store-bought card, balloons printed against a sky blue background, the kind you could find in any drugstore. Inside, her handwriting curved across the page in black ink: happy 10th, little man, you're my favorite, pain in the neck, don't grow up too fast. It should have ended there, but just below her name in smaller, tighter letters, almost as if she'd been writing in a hurry, was another line, one that did not belong in a birthday card. Don't trust who picks me up tonight. The boy stared at the words, not fully understanding. At first it read like a joke, except it wasn't funny, it was wrong, it was cold, in a way that made his chest feel hollow. He read it again. this time noticing how the ink seemed darker here, as if Shed pressed harder with the pen. The letters were slightly sharper, more deliberate. When he brought the card to his mother, she froze mid-step, her eyes catching on the bottom line. Her face drained in an instant, and she sat down at the kitchen table, as though her legs had decided for her. The police arrived within the hour. The card was placed into a clear evidence sleeve. Officers leaned over it like it might speak if they stared hard enough. The detective handling the case, a man who had long since dropped the comforting tone, asked the boy to recount exactly when Lena had given him the envelope what Shed said, whether Shed mentioned anyone picking her up. She just told me not to open it. Yet he said, and you didn't think to open it earlier. The boy's throat tightened. He shook his head, wishing the words would come out stronger, less like an admission. The detective didn't push further, but the look in his eyes said enough. If this warning had been found that night, things might have gone differently. The card became the center of the investigation. Who had Lena expected to pick her up? Why hadn't she refused? And if she knew she couldn't trust them, why hadn't she told someone directly? The possibilities were narrow and uncomfortable. The ride must have been arranged beforehand, or at least expected. It had to be someone she knew, someone close enough that she anticipated their involvement in her evening, which meant the danger wasn't a stranger lurking on a street corner. It was someone inside her circle. The handwriting was confirmed to be hers. The ink matched the pens in her bedroom. But beyond that, the message gave no clear direction, no name, no description, no time. It was like a key without a lock. Her father suggested maybe it was a prank, a cryptic joke. Shed planned to explain later, but the police didn't buy it. Neither did her mother, who swore Lena wasn't the type to joke in that way, especially not in writing. A forensic analyst noticed something odd when the card was held under oblique light. Faint impressions of writing could be seen on the opposite page, indentations from a pen pressing on paper, as if another note had been written on top of the card at some point on a separate sheet, leaving ghost marks behind. But the words were incomplete. One of them looked like drive, another might have been corner, and then a jagged line where the rest had been torn away, if it had ever been there at all. The theory emerged that the card hadn't been her first attempt to warn someone, that maybe Shed started a letter, then realized it was too dangerous to put everything down, that the single line at the bottom was all she dared leave behind. The emotional weight of that realization sank into the family like stone. The card wasn't just a clue, it was her last act before she vanished. It meant Shed known something was coming, and Shed been alone in it. For her brother, the guilt became a constant echo. He replayed the moment she handed him the envelope, wondering if there had been something in her eyes and her tone that should have told him to open it right away. He imagined alternative timelines where Head read it at the party, run to his parents, shouted her name before she stepped into whatever car had taken her away. But timelines like that are only real in your head. The truth was simpler and crueler. Shed given him the card, and he hadn't opened it, and whatever came for her that night happened without warning to anyone but her. The card would go on to be photographed, copied, cataloged in the evidence log, but in the quiet moments when the police weren't around, it still lived on the boy's desk, not as a clue, not as evidence, but as the last words his sister had written to him. When the words "Don't trust who picks me up tonight" were finally read aloud in the police briefing room, it was as if someone had drawn a tight circle around Lena's life and told the detectives, "Your suspect is in here." The possibilities were both comfortingly few and deeply unsettling. If the warning was real, the person who picked her up wasn't a stranger lurking in the dark. They were someone she knew, someone she expected, someone she could name. One, the family friend. The first name to surface was Daniel Moore, a longtime friend of the Walsh family. Daniel was in his late 30s, a mechanic who had fixed the Walsh's cars for years, had been at the party briefly that night, dropping off a gift for the boy. Before heading out, several neighbors remembered seeing his blue pickup parked outside the house earlier in the evening. Daniel claimed had gone home right after leaving the party, but when police checked his statement, there was a gap of nearly 40 minutes between when he left the Walsh's street and when his phone pinged near his house. He said had just driven around to clear his head. To most, Daniel was harmless, the kind of man who remembered your birthday, had stopped to push your car out of the snow. But the detectives noted something else. In Lena's school planner, tucked in a pocket, was a torn scrap of paper with a phone number, Daniel's number, to the boy from school. Then there was Kyle Benson, a senior at the high school 2 years older than Lena. Rumor had it they'd been talking, nothing official, but enough for classmates to notice. Kyle was charming in that way that made adults wary, but teenagers drawn in. He worked part-time at the gas station, and had been seen more than once walking home in the same direction. As Lena, Kyle admitted they'd been friends, though he denied anything romantic. He claimed had been at a friend's house that night playing video games until late. His alibi held mostly, but one witness, a classmate, recalled Lena saying just a week earlier that Kyle had offered her a ride home once, and Shed declined because something fell off in the lens of the birthday card. That small refusal suddenly looked like foreshadowing. 3. The neighbor across the street lived Patrick Willis, a quiet man in his 40s who kept to himself. He worked nights, often seen leaving as the sun was setting. Patrick was known for watching the street from his front porch, smoking slowly through the evenings. One neighbor, Mrs. Hollings, told police Shed noticed Patrick's car missing from its usual spot around the same time Lena was last seen. When questioned, Patrick said had gone to get groceries and then driven around to pass the time before work. The receipt from the store matched his story, but the timestamp left a 30-minute gap between the purchase and his clock-in at the factory. He wasn't close to the Walsh family, but Lena's brother remembered once seeing him talk to her at the mailbox too casually for too long for the relative in any missing person case. Family is never off the table. Lena's uncle Robert lived 2 towns over, but was known to visit occasionally. Had missed the party that night, claiming he was working late, but a toll booth camera caught his car heading toward Willow Creek just after 8 p.m. an hour before Lena left the house. He explained it as a last-minute change of plans and said had turned around when he realized he couldn't make it before the party ended. The police couldn't place him in town at the exact time Lena vanished, but the proximity was enough to raise eyebrows, and in the privacy of the Walsh home, the family's conversations grew tense. The card's warning wasn't just about a shadowy figure. It could have been about someone with their last name, a web of half-truths. Each suspect had something in common. Their stories almost worked, almost fit, almost explained everything, but always there was a sliver of time unaccounted for, a detail that didn't quite align, a tone in their voice that suggested something being left unsaid. Detectives began to piece together overlapping timelines. They mapped phone pings, car sightings, and witness statements on a board that slowly filled with red lines. The picture that emerged was frustratingly inconclusive. Too many overlaps to pin it on one person, too many contradictions to clear anyone entirely. The town's trust began to collapse under the weight of speculation. The diner, once a place for idle gossip, became a daily tribunal. Daniel's name came up over coffee, Kyle's over pie, Patrick's over the clink of silverware. People whispered in checkout lines, their voices sharp with certainty one day and doubtful the next. The emotional shift for the Walsh family. The suspects list was poisoned. Every face they'd once greeted with warmth was now a question mark. Every handshake felt colder. The boy stopped answering the door when people came by. His mother began drawing the curtains earlier each evening. His father's voice grew quieter at family gatherings, as though afraid of who might be listening. The card sat in an evidence locker now, but in their minds it was still there. Lena's last words looping endlessly, "Don't trust who picks me up tonight." The trouble was no one could agree on who was. The police's silent theory behind closed doors. The lead detective had a working theory. Lena had been offered a ride home by someone she knew, someone Shed reluctantly agreed to let drive her. Shed realized maybe hours before that it wasn't a good idea. The card was her attempt at leaving a breadcrumb in case something happened, but whatever happened in those 200 feet between the flickering street lamp and her front porch had been fast, deliberate, and quiet enough to leave almost no trace. The suspects were all still in the circle, and for the Walshes that meant every conversation at the grocery store, every wave from across the street, carried the unbearable weight of maybe. By the 4th week of the investigation, the circle of suspects hadn't grown smaller, but the detectives had changed their approach. Instead of casting the net outward, they began pulling it in. The Walsh home, once a sanctuary in the chaos, now felt like a place under siege, not from the press or the neighbors, though both lingered like shadows outside, but from the quiet persistence of questions that no one wanted to answer out loud. The first cracks the detectives started with finances. It was standard procedure. Pressure points often exposed the truth. That's when they learned the Walsh family had been struggling long before Lena vanished. The auto shop where her father worked had cut hours, that summer bills had been paid late, the mortgage company had sent letters in bold red type. Money problems alone didn't make someone dangerous, but they did create vulnerability, leverage someone else could use, desperation that could lead to choices best left unmade. The father's past then came a detail From deeper in the past, in 1995, Lena's father, Mark Walsh, had been questioned, though never charged, in connection with a workplace incident involving a teenage employee. The records were thin. The case had never gone to trial, but the whispers had been enough to follow him for years. Had moved jobs twice before settling in Willow Creek, where the story had mostly been forgotten. When the detectives brought it up, he bristled. That was years ago, he said, jaw tight, and it was nothing but in the mind of an investigator. Nothing is a word that deserves to be picked apart. The mother's silence. If Mark was defensive, Lena's mother, Elaine, was the opposite: quiet, careful, almost overly precise in her answers. She remembered exact times and details from the night Lena disappeared, but when asked about the days leading up to it, her memory seemed to skip. One moment, she was talking about making the birthday cake. The next, she claimed she couldn't remember whether Lena had been home the afternoon before the party. Detectives noticed that every time the subject turned toward Lena's social life, her friends, her activities, Elaine would redirect the conversation to something domestic, as if the less said the better. An argument in the kitchen. A neighbor eventually came forward claiming she'd overheard shouting through the open kitchen window a few days before Lena vanished. A man's voice, deep, angry, a woman's voice, sharper, cutting him off. And then what the neighbor swore was Lena's voice pleading, "I said I don't want to." The neighbor hadn't thought much of it at the time. Families argued, after all, but in hindsight the words seemed heavier. The uncle again. And then there was Robert, Mark's younger brother. His name had already surfaced earlier in the suspect pool, but when police pressed further, they found out had stayed overnight at the Walsh's home 2 weeks before the disappearance. During that visit, according to Elaine, Lena had kept to her room. Robert described it differently. He claimed she'd been friendly, talkative, and had even asked him for a ride to a friend's house one evening. No one could confirm the ride took place, and Robert's tone when talking about Lena struck one detective as just a little too familiar. A family divided. The effect of this scrutiny was immediate and corrosive. Mark became quieter around the house, his movements slower, as though carrying something heavier than just grief. Elaine seemed to vanish into her routines: cooking, cleaning, folding laundry that didn't need folding, and the boy, caught in the crossfire of suspicion, stopped asking questions entirely. When the police interviewed them separately, the family's timelines didn't perfectly align. Mark claimed Lena had been in the living room before leaving for the party. Elaine insisted she'd last seen her in the kitchen. The boy thought she'd been upstairs. Small discrepancies, maybe, or the kind of subtle misremembering that hides something deeper. The card's shadow. The birthday card by now had become more than evidence. It was a wedge. Whoever Lena had been warning about could have been sitting at that very table that night, could have been helping serve cake, could have been laughing with the rest of them, while she quietly calculated her exit. For the detectives, the question became less about who and more about why. Why write the message instead of speaking it out loud? Why give it to her brother? Why not her mother or father? The unspoken possibility hung in the air. Maybe she didn't trust one of them either. A conversation the boy never forgot. One night in the weeks after Lena disappeared, the boy heard his parents talking in the kitchen after they thought he was asleep. She knew something. His mother whispered, "That doesn't mean." His father began, but she cut him off. "She knew, Mark, and she didn't tell us." A pause. Then his father, softer, "Maybe she couldn't." He didn't know what they meant then. He still isn't sure. But when he remembers it now, it feels like the truest thing anyone ever said about Lena's disappearance. The police would never officially name a family member as a suspect, but the damage was done. The Walsh home, already quieter without Lena's voice, became a place of constant unspoken suspicion, a place where the question wasn't just where did she go, but who among us knows more than they're saying. Her name was Megan Holt. She and Lena had been inseparable since 7th grade, the kind of friendship stitched together by shared secrets, inside jokes, and late-night phone calls about nothing at all. They'd drifted slightly in the past year, as teenage lives tend to do, but Megan still thought of Lena as her closest friend. For weeks, Megan had stayed quiet. She attended the vigils, helped tape missing posters to telephone poles, and cried with the rest of the town whenever the police came to school to re-interview students. She gave them the same safe answers everyone else did. Lena was normal. Lena was fine. No, I don't know why she would disappear, but guilt has a way of growing heavier in silence. The call. On a Wednesday afternoon, Megan walked into the police station alone. Her hands were in the pockets of her hoodie, her hair pulled back tight, like she was bracing against something. She asked to speak to whoever was in charge of Lena's case. Detective Harris, the lead investigator, sat across from her. In a small interview room, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Megan's voice was low but steady. "I didn't tell you everything before," she said. And then she told me she was scared the week before. Megan explained that about a week before Lena's brother's birthday, the two had been walking home from school together. The days were getting shorter, the shadows longer. It was the same route they'd taken hundreds of times until Megan noticed Lena glancing over her shoulder more than usual. Is someone following us? Megan had asked, half joking. Lena's reply had been quiet. It's just he's been around a lot lately. When Megan pressed, Lena clammed up. She didn't say a name. She didn't describe him, only that she'd seen the same car more than once, slow, just behind her, turning onto the same streets. And that once she thought she saw the driver at the gas station, watching her. The unspoken agreement, Megan admitted, she hadn't taken it seriously. They were teenage girls in a small town. Attention from older boys or strangers was uncomfortable, yes, but it was also something they'd been taught to shrug off. She'd teased Lena about having a secret admirer, and Lena had rolled her eyes, but hadn't laughed. The truth, Megan said, was that she'd noticed Lena's behavior change after that. She'd started walking home faster, keeping her phone in her hand. She'd turned down offers of rides, even from people they knew. One afternoon, she even cut through backyards instead of taking the main road, just to avoid passing the oak trees on Maple Avenue. The last conversation 2 days before the party, they'd had one last conversation about it. Megan said they were sitting in the cafeteria when Lena told her, if anything weird happens, I'll make sure someone knows. At the time, Megan thought it was just paranoia talking. Now, in the wake of the birthday card, it sounded like a plan. Detective Harris asked why she hadn't come forward with this earlier. Megan's hands twisted in her lap. Because I thought it didn't matter, she said, and then quieter. And because I didn't want to be part of it. Reframing the card, the detectives left that interview with something they hadn't had before: context. The line in the birthday card wasn't just a sudden thought scribbled in a moment of doubt. It was the culmination of a week of fear. Lena had known, or at least strongly suspected, that the person picking her up that night was someone she couldn't trust, and more importantly, she'd been carrying that knowledge alone, the burden of guilt. When news of Megan's confession reached the Walsh family, reactions were split. Elaine cried, partly out of gratitude for finally hearing something concrete, partly out of anguish that it had been kept from them for so long. Mark was less forgiving, muttering under his breath about kids thinking they can handle everything themselves. The boy, though, he didn't blame Megan. If anything, her confession deepened his own guilt, because now it was clear the card wasn't random. It wasn't vague. It was the final step in a plan Lena had already been building, a plan she'd entrusted, however indirectly, to him. A name, unspoken. The worst part, Megan still couldn't give them a name. The car she'd seen was dark, maybe green, maybe blue. The driver had a cap pulled low. The details were slippery, indistinct, the way memories often are when they're not anchored in certainty. The absence of a name left the investigation still mired in the same circle of suspicion, but it also sharpened the emotional reality. Lena's last week hadn't been ordinary. She'd been living in a slow-building state of dread, and no one had stopped it. The detectives now had a timeline of fear, but timelines aren't enough, and the night Lena vanished still had to be reconstructed moment by moment if they were ever going to see where she slipped away. The police called it a timeline. The family called it the last time anyone saw her alive. It was Friday, October 12, 2002. Temperature 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Sky clear, moonless. Sunset had been at 6:27 p.m. Lena left the party at approximately 8:14 p.m. The goodbye. The living room still smelled faintly of frosting and candles. Guests were trickling out. Lena zipped up her jacket, hugged her little brother one last time, and stepped onto the front porch. She had the yellow birthday card in her hand. Witness her mother, Elaine Walsh. Statement: she said she was fine walking. It was just 3 blocks. Note: Elaine did not see which direction she turned after stepping off the porch. 8:16 p.m. First street lamp. Neighbor Jeff Tully saw Lena pass under the first street lamp on Maple Avenue. Statement: she was walking fast, but not running. Looked like she was just trying to get out of the cold. Tully also noted a faint rumble of an engine in the distance, though he couldn't see where it came from. He assumed it was someone pulling into a driveway. 8:17 p.m. The curve. This is where the street bends left, and the oak trees lean inward. Street lamps are spaced wider. Here, shadows gather in the gaps. Witness: a man walking his dog. Statement: she looked over her shoulder, once not scared, just like she knew someone was there. His dog pulled forward to sniff at something in the grass. When he looked up again, she was closer to the flickering street lamp. 8:18 p.m. The flickering light. Street lamp 7 on Maple had been faulty for months, sometimes stuttering, sometimes going out entirely. According to the witness, it flickered twice as Lena passed beneath it. He looked down at his dog again. When he looked back up, She was gone 8:19 p.m. The missing 40 seconds from the flickering street lamp to Lena's front gate is less than 200 feet 40 seconds walk. At most, no one saw her make that final turn. No one heard a scream. No one reported seeing a struggle. It's here that the police believe she got into a car voluntarily or otherwise. 8:20 p.m. The car door neighbor, Mrs. Hollings, heard the muffled thud of a car door closing followed by the slow roll of tires on asphalt. She did not look outside. She assumed it was a neighbor coming home late. Direction unclear. She could not say whether the car drove toward the main road or deeper into the neighborhood. 8:23 p.m. The gap, by the time Lena's absence was noted, the trail had already cooled in those 3 minutes. A vehicle could have traveled nearly a mile in any direction out toward the highway, into the back roads behind the town, or even into one of the many driveways that line the quieter streets. Reconstruction by the detectives, using all available statements, the police pieced together a speculative sequence. Lena leaves the party card in hand. She turns left on a Maple car, begins following the engine heard by Tully, may have been idling ahead or slowly shadowing her from behind. She reaches the curve. She checks over her shoulder, confirming the presence Shed feared. All week approaches flickering street lamp. This point becomes the visual break in her timeline. Contact is made. She may have been called over, or the car may have pulled alongside. She enters vehicle under duress or by agreement. No one knows. Car departs. Door closes. Engine rolls, disappearing into night. Points of friction. If Lena knew she was being picked up by someone she didn't trust, why not run the last 200 feet? Why didn't she call someone, especially if she had her phone? Her phone was never recovered. Records show no outgoing calls after 7:55 p.m. Was the meeting prearranged, or was it opportunistic? Detectives wrestled with these questions, aware that the answers might hinge on details forever lost in that 40-second gap. The sound of nothing. What disturbs investigators most is the absence of sound. No shout, no engine revving in a hurry, no slamming of doors loud enough to draw attention. Whatever happened there happened quietly. That suggests control, either through trust or through a calm, calculated approach designed not to raise alarm. The chilling parallel. One detective later noted that Megan Holt's story about Lena being followed matched perfectly with the timing of the disappearance. In both instances, a car hovered at the edge of her awareness, not close enough to confront, but close enough to claim her. When the opportunity came, the flickering light on Maple Avenue became more than a detail in the case file. It became a symbol. The last place Lena was ever seen, caught between shadow and light, between suspicion and disappearance. In the days that followed, the police would focus on that stretch of road with relentless attention. They photographed every inch, measured tire marks, even replaced the faulty street lamp, as though correcting it could undo what had happened there. But it couldn't. The 40 seconds were gone. The card had already been handled, read, and analyzed. It had been photographed for evidence, dusted for prints, and logged in the chain of custody forms. To the Walsh family, it was a piece of their daughter's voice, but to the detectives it was an object in a bag, another piece of paper to be filed, until the forensics team decided to take another look. The technician's observation, the discovery, came from a detail no one had considered at first. Paper remembers pressure even if ink is absent. The grooves left by a pen remain faint, almost invisible, but present if you know how to look. The forensic technician placed the card under an oblique light, a strong beam angled just right, so that any indentations would cast tiny shadows. That's when she saw them, faint shallow lines pressed into the paper running perpendicular to Lena's written message. They weren't part of the printed balloons or her birthday note. They were something else entirely. The ghost writing. The impressions were partial, as if someone had once been writing on a separate piece of paper laid directly on top of the card. The pressure of the pen had transferred the shapes into the card's surface. The team used an ESDA device, electrostatic detection apparatus, a tool designed to visualize these indentations. What emerged was unsettling fragments of words. One looked like drive, another like corner. A partial date 12th was visible near the margin, and then a jagged interruption where the rest was missing. Two possibilities. The detectives debated what it meant. Possibility 1, Lena had begun writing a longer note, maybe a full explanation of her concerns, maybe even a name, but decided to remove it, leaving only the short line, "Don't trust who picks me up tonight," as her final message. This would suggest she had second thoughts, worried someone might see the longer version. Possibility 2, someone else had written over the card before it reached her brother, and then removed that paper entirely, leaving only these ghost marks. Behind this possibility was far darker. It meant someone had intercepted the card before the family ever saw it. The timing question. The forensic team pointed out another troubling fact: the indentations were heavier near the center of the card, but grew lighter toward the edges, as if the writer had been hurried or distracted. This could mean Lena had been under pressure when she wrote it, either emotionally or physically. If she had torn away a larger letter, where had it gone, and who had the chance to take it before the card ended up in her brother's hands? The brother's reaction when the detectives told Lena's brother about the indentations. His first question was, does that mean she wrote more for me? No one could answer him. They didn't know whether the impressions were hers or someone else's, but in his mind it felt like a second layer of guilt. Not only had he waited to open the card, but now it seemed he'd never truly see what shed meant to say. The family's divide. The revelation deepened the tension inside the Walsh home. Elaine believed it proved someone outside the family had tampered with the card, that it had been taken, altered, and returned before anyone noticed. Mark wasn't convinced. He thought Lena had simply changed her mind about saying too much. The detectives refused to commit to either interpretation, at least publicly, but in their private notes, several leaned toward the tampering theory. The problem was there was no way to prove it. The widening of the circle. The card went from being a strange, haunting message to a physical timeline, an object that had been in someone's possession after Lena wrote it, but before her brother received it. That gap, however brief, could hold the identity of the who she warned about, and if that person had the card long enough to alter it, they had been close enough to her in those final hours to intercept something meant only for her family, the last document she ever touched. One detective years later would say this wasn't just her last words, it was her last act. Whatever happened to Lena started before she stepped into that night. The card is proof she was already fighting something we couldn't see. It didn't narrow the suspect list, it didn't bring them closer to an arrest, but it cemented one truth: Lena hadn't been blindsided. She'd seen something coming, and she'd tried to leave a trail. It began with a phone call, a man's voice on the other end, low and deliberate, saying he had information about the girl from Willow Creek. He didn't give a name, just enough detail to make it clear he was talking about Lena. Detective Harris took the call in his office, pen poised above a notepad. The man claimed he knew who had picked Lena up that night. He said he'd seen her get into a green sedan near the corner of Maple and Cedar, and he claimed he knew where her things were hidden. The word things hit hard. It wasn't the word you used for a living person's belongings. The meeting they arranged to meet in the parking lot of an old feed store on the outskirts of town. The man was in his late 40s, wearing a ball cap pulled low, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He didn't look nervous. He looked like someone who'd been waiting for this moment. He repeated his story. Had been driving home from work the night of October 12th. He saw Lena talking to someone through the open passenger window of a green sedan. She got in willingly, but her face looked wrong. He described the driver as a man in his 30s with a sharp jaw and eyes that didn't smile. The location. Then came the part that made the detectives lean forward. The man claimed the car drove toward an abandoned cabin about 5 miles outside of town. He even gave directions: a turnoff from the old highway, a dirt path through a stretch of pine trees. It was the kind of lead they hadn't had in months. The next morning, a convoy of patrol cars and unmarked vehicles rolled down that road. The cabin was exactly where Head said it would be. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, and the porch was littered with broken boards. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old dust. In one corner, officers found a single women's sneaker, size 7, coated in dirt. For a moment, the room held its breath. It was close enough to Lena's size to feel like confirmation, but the sneaker was older than it looked. A check of the brand's serial number showed it had been manufactured in 1998, 4 years before Lena's disappearance, and had long since been discontinued. Whoever had left it there hadn't done so recently. No fingerprints, no fibers, no proof. The cracks in his story back at the station. The man's account began to unravel when detectives pressed for the exact time Head seen the car. His answers shifted when they asked why Head waited over a year to come forward. He muttered something about being scared, but couldn't say of what, and then they checked his background. He had a history of inserting himself into criminal investigations, offering tips that led nowhere, weaving himself into the narrative of other people's tragedies. It wasn't just unhelpful, it was pathological. The emotional cost for the Walsh family, the rise and fall of that lead, was brutal. For a day, they'd let themselves imagine answers. They'd let themselves picture a path toward closure, even if it was the kind no one wanted. And then, in the space of a single police briefing, it All collapsed back into silence. Mark stopped answering unknown numbers on the house phone. After that, Elaine stopped attending the press conferences. Their son, already shrinking from attention, became almost invisible. In public, the town's shift in Willow Creek, people didn't talk about Lena's case with the same urgency. After that, the false lead had drained something vital from the community, trust maybe, or stamina. Now, when her name came up, it was in shorter conversations. The posters on the diner bulletin board curled at the corners, unrefreshed. The collective will to believe in answers had been eroded. One resident put it simply, "We've been to the edge of finding out, and it was just another cliff." The investigation would continue, but with fewer eyes watching, fewer voices calling her name. And yet there was still one voice left, one that would speak years later when her brother returned to the place they both once called home. It had been 20 years. The boy from the birthday party was no longer a boy. His hair was darker, shorter. His face had the kind of lines you get from squinting at the world too long. But when he stepped onto Maple Avenue again, it was as if time had folded in on itself. The houses hadn't changed much, a few new coats of paint, a couple of replaced fences, but the bones were the same. The same oak trees leaned over the same curve in the road there, branches tangled like they'd been whispering for decades. And there, still standing, was the street lamp, repaired now, glowing steadily as if it had never flickered. He walked slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, his eyes scanning the spaces between things. It was October again. The air had the same metallic chill, leaves crunched underfoot. He could almost hear the muffled laughter from his 10th birthday party echoing across the years. In his pocket was the yellow envelope. The card had been returned to him long ago after the police had finished with it. The evidence sticker still clung to the back, its edges peeling inside. The handwriting hadn't faded. Lena's loops and curves were still sharp, her warning still just as stark. "Don't trust who picks me up tonight." Had read it hundreds of times, tracing the letters with his eyes until they became less like words and more like a shape burned into his memory. But he had never read them here, not on the street where she had written there, ending 3 blocks. He started from the front porch of his childhood home. 3 blocks to the party house, 3 blocks back again. That was all it should have been. 40 seconds from the flickering lamp to the safety of the gate. He walked the same path she had, counting the steps in his head, past the first street lamp, past the curve beneath the branches. Every few paces, head stop, look over his shoulder, trying to imagine what she'd seen. Did she see headlights in the distance, a familiar face leaning out a window? Did she hesitate? Did she already know she wouldn't make it to the porch? The lamp, when he reached the street lamp, he stood beneath it for a long time. It didn't flicker. Now the bulb hummed, quietly steady. He wondered if she had looked up at it just before stepping into the dark. The air felt thicker here, like it remembered what had happened, like the ground itself had been holding its breath for 20 years. The what-ifs had spent years torturing himself with them. What if he had opened the card that night? What if he had chased her down the street when he saw her leave with it in her hand? What if had been the one walking beside her under these trees? The what-ifs were a second life. He carried a ghost parallel to his own, where she'd come home that night, where the card was just a card, the words that stay. Finally, he opened the envelope again. The paper felt fragile now, like it might tear if handled too roughly. He read her words one more time, his breath clouding in the cold, happy 10th. "Little man, you're my favorite pain in the neck. Don't grow up too fast." And beneath the line that had outlived her, "Don't trust who picks me up tonight." He closed his eyes in the silence. He could almost hear her voice saying it, not in fear, but in a steady, certain tone, like someone who'd already decided to leave a mark, even if she couldn't stop what was coming. No resolution. There was no breakthrough waiting for him here, no sudden memory, no hidden clue, just the same road, the same trees, the same space. She'd vanished from some people. Come back to places like this for closure. He wasn't sure that word applied. This wasn't an ending, it was a wound that didn't know how to scar. The last thought before he turned to leave, he spoke out loud for the first time since arriving. She was supposed to be walking toward home, he said quietly, almost to himself, but maybe she knew she was walking away from it. Then he put the card back into his pocket, the handwriting safe, but fading, and walked away from the street lamp the same way she had, but this time alone.